and welcome. As you know, the federal government has been proactive in continuity of operations, or COOP planning, since at least the 1950s, when President Eisenhower issued executive orders directing various measures agencies should take to prepare for a possible nuclear war. The need for COOP leads naturally to the question of resilience, how quickly agencies can recover from events beyond their control. In 2018, the Government Accountability Office issued a report, Long-Range Emerging Threats Facing the United States as Identified by Federal Agencies, which identified 26 long-term threats in 4 categories, including climate change. Following the release of Executive Order 13990, the federal government recently invested a significant amount of effort in preparing for the effects of climate change. The Department of Defense in June hosted a climate resilience workshop that addressed ways to enhance adaptation and resilience through collaboration, and an interagency effort will build on its success. Today, we'll meet thought leaders from government and industry who will discuss the impact of Executive Order 13990, the changes in the threat landscape that require new thinking about climate resilience, and how agencies can plan to build resilience capacity as risks expand. So let's meet our panel of experts. First, I'd like to introduce Paul Farnan. Paul is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installation, Energy, and Environment. Paul, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Also here with us, Adriana Hochberg. She is Principal Deputy Associate Administrator at EPA. Adriana, thanks for coming today.
Thank you.
Also, Philip McNamara, Assistant Secretary for Administration, Department of Transportation. Phil, good to see you.
Great to be here.
It's wonderful to have all of you. This is quite a panel, ladies and gentlemen. Brett Sims, Executive Director for the Office of Asset Enterprise Management within VA's Office of Management and Chief Sustainability Officer. Thanks for being here today. All right. And Rachel Ross. Rachel is Deputy Chief Sustainability Officer at DoD. Rachel, it's a pleasure to have you. Keith Bryan is with us. He's the Director of Federal Advisory Sustainability, Environmental and Climate at KPMG.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, nice to have you. And then finally, Rob Fisher, Partner, U.S. ESG Leader for KPMG. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks for being here today. All right, let's start with you, Paul, if you're open. Let's talk about the main drivers and motivations behind the Army's climate strategy and how it aligns with the National Defense Strategy and the Army vision for climate resilience.
Sure. So the Army put out its climate strategy about 1.5 years ago now. We were the first service to do that. We're very proud of that. And essentially it came about originally because the President said climate change is a national security threat. And in fact, it very much is. And you can take away all the politics of climate change. But the fact is we are seeing climate change is affecting how we operate and where we operate. For instance, in Alaska, we have greatly increased the resources, the infrastructure investments, and the force structure in Alaska because of the increasingly importance of that theater of operations as the ice caps melt. But paradoxically, at the same time, Fort Wainwright, which is up in Fairbanks, Alaska, the middle of Alaska, a lot of that is built on the permafrost. So as we're increasing investment there, but the permafrost is melting. So the structures of the base itself, what's going to happen as that permafrost melts? So these are the things we have to look at. Additionally, National Guard forces. We have significantly increased the number of person hours that our National Guard forces are spending their summers doing wildland firefighting. So rather than doing their warfighting mission, they're now consumed with all of their days fighting wildfires in the West. So it's absolutely impacting what we do. But just as importantly, well, the climate strategy obviously is geared toward addressing climate change and reducing the emissions of the Army. What it also does is it's necessary for the capabilities of the fighting force. What's good for the climate, what's good for the climate and the environment is actually really good for the fighting force, which seems rather ironic, but it's true. Because what we need to do, we need to increase the resilience of all of our installations. We need to be able to operate in a contested homeland. If there's a war overseas, our forces are here domestically within the United States. We need to be able to mobilize our forces, get them overseas to the actual battlefield. But if there's some kind of an attack in the U.S., if there's a conflict overseas, something's probably going to happen here in the U.S., a cyber attack on the grid to take it down for days or weeks. That means no electricity for our installations. We still need to be able to operate to perform our national security mission. So that means we need energy resilience on our installations. That means we need self-generation that's fully contained within our fence line. It just so happens that renewable energy is, in fact, the best self-contained generation there is. And then, once we get to the battlefield, the operational energy, the fuel we use to support our warfighters, it's a tremendous logistical burden to move that liquid fuel forward to the operating battlefield. And for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, moving fuel to our forward base forces, we took over 1,000 casualties. That's 1,000 American soldiers that were killed or wounded guarding fuel lines. If we can reduce the amount of fuel we use on the battlefield, we can protect our soldiers at the same time increasing their capabilities. So, hybridizing our combat vehicles, reducing the amount of fuel required. That's all, yes, it's good for the climate, it's good for the environment, but it's also really good for the operational capability of the fighting force.
It's really fascinating that the technology is catching up with the need almost simultaneously.
Yes, it is. There's still a lot of advancement that the technology has to go through. For instance, I get it all the time, you cannot be 100% resilient with renewable generation right now. They're going to say the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. I get that. But if you look, like you said, where the technology has come to, the battery technology, how it's advanced over the last decade, if it continues on that trajectory over the next decade, we may very well be at 100% resilience with renewable generation.
All right, I love it. Phil, we'll turn to you next. Department of Transportation, big agency, lots of projects, I'm sure, that are underway, environmental impact projects. So please tell us about some of the more successful ones that you've been implementing.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, and thank Fed Insider for bringing us here together for this discussion. It's always good when when colleagues across the interagency can kind of get together and hear what each is doing. When Paul was talking about the resilience of Army installations, it reminds me of what we're doing internally at the Department of Transportation to ensure that our DOT facilities can also operate 24/7. Right, a large part of the Department of Transportation is the Federal Aviation Administration, and they have thousands of facilities across the country, air traffic control towers, air traffic control centers that need to be climate resilient. I serve as the department's Assistant Secretary for Administration and oversee facilities. I'm also the department's Chief Sustainability Officer. And we have a number of strategies underway with respect to our real property and our vehicle fleet to address the climate crisis. So to give you some sort of background of DOT, we have traditional office buildings. I mentioned air traffic control towers. We have research facilities and labs. We got ship fleets at maritime ports. We have academic buildings. We run the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy up in Long Island. We have heavy machinery. We have vehicle fleets. We have electrical substations, safety test tracks, and data centers. And all of those have critical safety communication assets that need to be protected. Another example that we're really, really proud of, and Secretary Pete, he goes by Secretary Pete, not Secretary Buttigieg, Secretary Pete has wanted us to sort of lead by example on is our efforts to reduce our vehicle fleet. Mid-sized vehicle fleet, about 6,000 vehicles.
To reduce or
Make the
transition.
Make the transition. Thank you. Make the transition to electric vehicles, and so we're really hard at work. There. I'm proud to say that in fiscal year 2022, DOT had over 70% of our new light duty, so sort of sedans and SUV vehicle acquisitions being zero emission vehicles, and that was the highest acquisition rate across the government. So obviously we're on track to implement President Biden's executive order with respect to zero emission vehicles, especially for the light duty vehicles ahead of 2027. So just a couple of things we have underway internally.
Well, that's a lot, of course, obviously, and being the agencies like EPA and Department of Transportation, I feel, and Department of Defense are sort of key to how the rest of the government handles its own priority initiatives too. So it's great to hear from you. And I saw you Keith, shaking your head while he was speaking. So I want to ask you your question next. So you work with a lot of different agencies. Many of them have diverse missions, like you've just heard. How do you help them in terms of their sustainability program goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So, at KPMG, obviously, we have the advantage of having that more overarching perspective on what's happening throughout the federal government, which good and bad. The bad is that we don't get necessarily into the weeds as much as some of the people that directly drive the programs. However, the good is we can see similarities and differences as they're happening across the federal government. So, a couple of the areas that we really see as, I guess, common challenges throughout the government. Number one, I would say, first and foremost, is data, right? And it sounds like a pretty generic answer right off the bat. There is certainly no shortage of data, right? Every federal agency will tell you that they are inundated with the amount of data that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Are not effectively curating that or validating it or making it so that it is a useful component of their mission strategy, right? So that is a huge challenge, transitioning that from what I would call a repository of something that you have on hand to more of a usable asset in order to make your mission and your program areas more effective, right? The second that I would see with energy, sustainability, climate change programs is just the integration into the other programmatic areas, right? So you typically see them as framed as more of a nice to have, right? And so that sort of puts them in that realm of, okay, if you can make us greener or if you can make us more climate resilient, that's great. Go do your thing. Like that's off to the side, right? But it's not embedded into the day-to-day functionality of how the program areas are run. And so that integration, you're starting to see it a little bit more with climate than you are with sustainability, I would say, because climate does pose a very real threat profile, as you mentioned, to day-to-day operations, right? And so that integration into other programs is really how climate risk or any sort of risk management or sustainability programs are supposed to function in a perfect world, right? And so by doing that, you are improving your other program areas. So if you're doing climate risk assessment, you are improving other aspects of your COOP processes as well.
It has to be in areas like procurement and any interactions you might have with other contractors like yourself.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you should be able to point to some sort of sustainability element in just about every program area in your department. So there's procurement, there are operational folks, there are IT, cybersecurity elements, there are fleet aspects. Just about everything has some piece of the puzzle to this. And so integrating that all is important.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, so since you said you want to cross-talk.
I do. I do.
So I'm going to let Rachel talk next about what DoD is doing as far as acquisition, because that's really driven by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who Rachel works for. But on the Army side, I agree completely, and that's one of the things that we're doing. So the Army has a lot of buildings. 167,000 some odd buildings, more than anybody else. That's where most of our emissions come from. So we're looking at how do we change how we build, how do we renovate things. So one of the things that we've done is form a partnership with the Corps of Engineers, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which builds not just for us, but for most of the federal government. We've worked some resources for them, and they're developing training programs so that, like you said, the sustainability and the renewable energy and the energy efficiency is not a nice-to-do add-on kind of thing at the end of the building, but they're training their engineers and planners to actually incorporate it right from the beginning of their planning and design.
Exactly.
It needs to be baked in.
Exactly.
All right. So wonderful. And Rachel, did you want to follow on with that? I have you down for the ways that the Defense Department is responding to climate change through adaptation and mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases. Take it from there.
Yeah, I think building on the theme of integration, that was actually my bumper sticker for this answer, in the sense that it's, at least I struggle with thinking about adaptation versus mitigation, I see them as interconnected and intertwined. And every intervention, every investment that DoD makes related to climate, sustainability, energy, it's all about advancing that DoD mission, like what Paul was saying. And you have a great climate benefit that comes out of that, but it's really for the purpose of advancing that DoD mission, supporting the warfighter, the service members, their families, improving quality of life, making mission effectiveness, reducing risk, all of those things. So that's sort of our sort of guiding North Star. And the integration is in that sense, but also when we think about the actions that we're taking as a leader in federal sustainability and implementing Executive Order 14057, which a lot of the CSOs spend a lot of time focusing on, we're also trying to integrate solutions there as well, especially when we're looking at our installation management. So looking at carbon pollution-free electricity and meeting that target. Bringing CFE onto our installations can bring resilience, like Paul was talking about, have on-site generation, storage, microgrids. That enables you to be more resilient in the face of a climate disaster or cyber attack or any other threat. At the same time, zero-emission vehicles. If we have sort of advanced technology is deployed at our installations, then we can have bidirectional charging, and we can use these vehicles as a way to store energy and to be more resilient. And our efficient buildings, right? As we bring down our footprint and we need to reduce our demand for energy, then we improve our resilience because we need less, right? So trying to look at all of it in an integrated way at the installation level is something that we've been trying to do more proactively within the department. And I know the Army's been doing great work on that, and I'll let Paul talk about his microgrid work later. But yeah, that's kind of the first thing. And on the acquisition front, I would say looking at our operations, our operational energy use, the fuel that goes into our platforms and systems, that is the majority of our energy demand, right? And so it's a big challenge, but the Deputy Secretary of Defense has been very forward-leaning on that issue, put out guidance last year in April requiring, when we go through the acquisition process, that we have to consider operational energy in every system. So rather than assuming away that energy will be available at any point in any scenario, you have to really do the analysis and show that you've thought about all the potential ways that energy could potentially pose a risk to that platform. And so making sure that we're bringing down our energy demand in our systems, because in a contested logistics environment, not even in a future fight, in a today fight, we're seeing this happening in Ukraine now.
Yeah.
Energy can be used as a weapon against us, and so having that demand in check is really important. And as we pursue those initiatives and try to pursue research and development that can improve the efficiency of our platforms, use alternative supply, that also benefits the mission.
And do you put timelines to these goals and objectives?
Mm-hmm. I mean, with the acquisition piece, it's kind of starting immediately.
Yeah.
And we have a governance system in place where we're trying to hold folks accountable, but it definitely, the acquisition timelines are very long in the Department of Defense, and then the systems stay in place for 50 years plus, so we've got to get it right on the front end.
Boy, that is the truth. That's quite an undertaking. I appreciate your answer on that.
Thanks.
Brett, I want to go to you. VA, major agency, 1,700 sites across the country, many of which have already experienced some aspect of climate change, wildfires, drought, heat waves. How do you prioritize the actions that you take for your various agencies and responsibilities with many of the VA hospitals and other centers that you operate around the country?
So those 1,700 facilities, they're in every state. So we do deal with all of those different risks at different locations that are out there, and that does compound the issue there. I'll also say that this isn't just a threat for us. We've actually experienced some of the impacts of some of these things. We've had multiple medical centers that have been significantly damaged, one in New Orleans that was completely destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, and our Manhattan Medical Center was flooded during Hurricane Sandy. And while took those out of mission delivery for a period of time, it's also given us some lessons learned on how to make our facilities more resilient to those types of events that are out there. So we're looking at this in a couple of different ways, and you'll hear thematically it's very similar to what a lot of the other agencies are doing. We start on the data side, so we need to know where to go invest in some of these things. So we've done a climate assessment, a vulnerability assessment across all of our critical facilities out there to identify which of the risks are real and what degree those risks could apply to those facilities, to then help drive what investments might be needed at those locations that are out there. The next thing we're trying to do is to get ahead of the curve and to build this into our planning processes. And our planning processes involve both capital planning, so the priority of what investments could help resiliency is an important thing that we've done, and we built sustainability directly into that process. So as we're looking at 1,000 or 2,000 potential projects, that is a direct factor in what we invest in that's out there. But we've also got to make sure we're getting ahead of the actual development of the projects. So things as simple as where you build. So what location you're going to build on. Is it in a flood zone? Is it susceptible to wildfires? That needs to be part of our process, and we're making sure that we've got those built in up front. Again, we're also trying to leverage some of those lessons learned. So in the case of Manhattan, for example, the flooding was bad enough, but all of our critical infrastructure was in the basement. So when it flooded, it knocked it all out. So can you design differently? Can you look at moving critical systems up in the building or into penthouses? Those are things that are getting built in. So as we do identify what investments and in the right places, we prioritize, but then we're building the right thing at the end to help deliver on some of those resilience issues that we've already experienced in the portfolio.
Can I ask, does this require some new, intelligence within the agency or new hiring to get the kind of expertise that you need in this area?
It's a great question. So we actually, to what Paul had mentioned there, we use the Army Corps of Engineers for a lot of our large construction. We do partner with DoD and DHA, the Defense Health Agency, in a lot of areas. So a lot of this comes into sharing of information.
Right.
So it may not have to be within VA, but between our industry partners and our other public sector partners, a lot of it does exist. So how can we tap into that and bring that into play to help us move forward on some of our resilience and sustainability goals?
So Rob, based on that last comment, talk about the opportunities that private sector companies are working on that federal agencies may be able to take advantage of.
Yeah, well, for starters, thanks for having me, but amazing to hear what's going on with our government, because some of it is really advanced. Like, we could certainly learn in the private sector, I think, a lot of what is being done here. And I didn't even script Keith ahead of time, but really data and data management, that is really been the name of the game lately. And I think it's, internal data, it's like, how do you curate and get to the most granular level of data that you can? And so helping organizations figure that out, site level, asset level, so that you can make decisions. I think what you talked about at transportation and VA, right? It's tools that you can get to that incredibly granular level of data so you can actually act upon it. But then I think the other big focus has been, how do you then get those other outside data sources that you need that maybe live beyond the virtual four walls of your organization, but that matter in your value chain more broadly? So, a lot of our clients, they struggle with, hey, I'm trying to drive in my supply chains emissions out, understand the resilience issues I have. Well, now there's more innovative data providers out there. There's one called Floodlight that we work with that can use sensors to directly measure scope 1 and 2 emissions anywhere in the world based on geolocation, so down to the asset level. So by being able to do that, it's a real game changer when you maybe have big otherwise data gaps from providers that just aren't as sophisticated to be able to get that information. So I think that's step one. And then how do you manage all that data? Sort of talked about that. But having a climate data lake with the right applications running on top, where you can get, in our case, a lot of our clients are worried about the reporting under a lot of different standards, but then they also need the insights to be able to make good decisions. I think one very quick example, we worked with an agriculture company that has that data down to a plot by plot level all across the United States, so that they can figure out with limited resilience and adaptation dollars, like how to prioritize which actions in what order to get the maximum benefit. Where can I, most improve yield or most protect myself from, climate interventions that hurt production, right? So I think having that kind of information is really where the name of the game is right now.
So do you envision a future where people are really using geospatial intelligence to make decisions about where to build or what to build or how to build, and using that data to make decisions about their investments for the future?
Yeah, and I don't think that's the future. I think there's.
It's the present.
I think I heard a couple here today that they're already doing that, and there's certainly many organizations in the private sector too that are already doing that.
Okay, that's fascinating, really.
And
yes.
Yeah, just one more tool to add to the examples here. The Defense Climate assessment tool, which actually grew out of the Army Corps of Engineers originally. DCAT is a great example of providing a sort of user-friendly platform for DoD customers, basically, or decision makers who are exactly what you were describing on the VA side. If you have an installation and you want to understand what the potential risks are related to climate to that specific site, they're able to bring in some of the analysis and make it available to inform decision making if it's going to be underwater or if it's going to be at high risk of wildfire or other things. So that's just another example. We're actually in the process now of sharing that tool with some of our key allies and partners, and had a ceremony a few months ago where we had a handful of representatives from the embassies here in DC come and sort of receive the DCAT tool for their country, and there's kind of ongoing exchange and dialogue around that. So I think that's another great example.
That's wonderful. Did you want to comment, Keith?
Yeah, I just think this also presents a larger opportunity for across the federal government. So we've heard several folks mention that we've in-house developed a tool to do the climate risk assessment and what have you, right? And all of those are sort of aiming for the same purpose, right? So there is an opportunity for more of an interagency approach to this, because fundamentally, if you look at climate risks, the risks are similar or the same, right? Exactly. It's how you prioritize your approach to that. So it's the adaptation features or the mission-specific approaches that are really going to differ. But that underlying risk profile is the same. So when we see that, not only in federal government, we also see that in the private sector, there's a lot of duplicative efforts for risk assessment and profiling that could be easily taken up to that next level and sort of made available to everybody across the board.
That's great. This is a great conversation. I love it. Paul, I want to go back to you. The Army has a lot of innovation that it's developing, going through, updating new systems, including installing self-sufficient energy systems on every installation by 2035. That's the stated goal. Can you tell us about that, how it's going?
So I think you're referring to the microgrids that we're doing. Part of the climate strategy was to have a microgrid on every installation by 2035 because microgrids they're the key part for the energy resilience, so that we can island our installations and direct energy to our mission critical systems. It is going very well, actually. We have, I think, we've got about 20 under construction. Wow. We've got between 10 and 20 that are in the immediate pipeline for planning and funding, and then we've got another 50 that are in planning process. So we are very much on track to getting to that 2035 goal.
Okay, and what does that look like? What does the decision making look like for which bases get it, how fast it happens?
So I try not to pick favorites while I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. Obviously, there are some bases that are critical for mission critical for our mission. Fort Liberty in North Carolina with the 82nd Airborne Division. There are others that have infantry divisions, cavalry divisions, armored divisions. The immediate response warfighters. We call them power projection platforms. So we absolutely, those are kind of the priority bases. But I try not to do that at the expense of our other installations. So every installation, if there are soldiers living on bases, then that base is important because every soldier is important no matter what that mission is, because every mission supports the greater mission of the U.S. Army. So we are working through it installation by installation, and while some people may focus more on the power projection platforms, it really comes down to the installation itself. What the dynamics of that installation are. And a lot of it is leadership matters. The people in place matter. We've got some installations with garrison commanders that are very forward-leaning and want to do more and more and move out. And they're the ones that are going to get more support because they're initiating it. I can't sit here and go to 100 different bases and say you should be doing this. A perfect example I'll give you is Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. The two-star general down there called me early last spring and said, "Hey, I want my base to be completely energy resilient." And I was thrilled with that phone call, because it's not me sitting here trying to force something down. It's the warfighter, the two-star general who's in command of the division down there, saying we need this for our warfighting capability. So because of that, we're working very closely. We envision we've been 6 months into the planning process. Fort Bliss will be 100% resilient using carbon-free energy within the next few years. So those are the places where we can really focus a lot of effort.
Okay, so is that a change management issue for you, trying to talk to people and communicate with them about,
It is, but it's also, when we talked about making it part of the mission itself, putting it into the culture, and more people are realizing that. They realize that we're not doing this on some far left green agenda. We're doing it because it's important to the mission. Fort Bliss needs energy resilience. When that armored division is called upon, it needs to be able to go. Another example I'll give you is the 25th Infantry Division out in Hawaii. So they cover the Indo-Pacific region, one of the more important regions that we're focused on right now. I had a call, again, they called me, the Deputy Commanding General called me and said, hey, my biggest problem is battlefield power generation. How do we get power and energy onto the forward battlefield? And these are the folks that go onto small islands throughout the Pacific. They're going to be on the very front edge of any kind of conflict in the Pacific. So we are working very closely with the 25th Infantry Division. We're getting them technology that they can use, so their forward operating bases that are completely powered by diesel generators, we're getting them battery technology and other advanced technology to do pilot projects. What can we do to actually reduce the amount of fuel they need to bring out onto the battlefield?
why don't you talk about how this factors into procurements?
Sure. So, annually we spend, DOT spends, anywhere between, $8 to $9 billion dollars a year on goods and services. And, we are looking right now holistically as to how that, we want to leverage that. We want to leverage the power of our spending to essentially, buy cleaner, right? And have, we want to advance climate-ready services and supplies. So we have, just as an example, we have underway what we're calling a lower carbon procurement pilot, and this is, looking at, and it's working with acquisition professionals, program managers across the department to make sustainable choices in how we do procurement. So we have two primary objectives here. One, we want to create awareness of materials with low embodied carbon emissions, and two, we want to advance their acquisition. So this is really getting at sort of how we use environmental product declarations or EPDs. And for those not familiar, EPDs are akin to sort of a nutrition label that you
Right.
You see, and we really look at on those EPDs. We really look at the global warming potential figure. And so we're looking at our pilot is targeting our areas most likely to have lower carbon options. For us, that's concrete, steel, and asphalt. And DOT, we build stuff. We build roads and bridges. So we use concrete, steel, and asphalt. We also, something that probably doesn't come to mind is the pilot is also targeting office furniture, right? And the emergence of lower carbon furniture options. And we just actually recently awarded several contracts incorporating lower carbon alternatives at our headquarters facility here in DC. We just awarded a contract for office furniture and equipment that considers lower carbon options. So just a few things we have underway. It's all sort of holistically called our Buy Clean program, and again, that's going to sort of serve as the foundation for achieving net zero procurement emissions. So that's our efforts.
That's really fascinating because you all have very different missions, and Adriana, part of that for you at your agency is working on grants and loans with your partners. So talk to us about how you build climate resiliency into those decisions that you're making.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's an exciting time at EPA because through both the bipartisan infrastructure law bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, in total, EPA received $100 billion. No, that's billion with a B.
That's real money.
Real money. We don't at EPA. We don't often speak in billions, so for us it's a lot.
She wants to make sure. B.
Big B. And these dollars are flowing directly to communities. And so we have a long list of loans and grants programs, probably in the dozens. I'm going to just focus on 4 here to give you a sense of the types of financial resources that we are making available to communities. The first is through our existing state revolving funds programs. Over $50 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law was made available for both our clean water and our drinking water state revolving funds. These dollars can be used to provide low-cost financing for water quality and infrastructure projects. And eligible projects include those that help address drought, wildfire, water conservation, energy efficiency, and more. A second grant that I want to highlight is our climate pollution reduction grants. We received $5 billion for this particular grant program through the Inflation Reduction Act. And it provides support to communities to help them adapt to climate change and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. This particular grant is actually in 2 phases. There's a planning grant, and then jurisdictions can receive implementation grants. And many states, tribes, and cities have already received their share in grant funding to support local planning for greenhouse gas reductions. And we're also encouraging climate smart investments in tree planting and green infrastructure projects that can lower temperatures and cool neighborhoods. While the focus of this particular grant is on reducing climate pollution, climate action plans can include strategies that simultaneously support both greenhouse gas mitigation and climate adaptation. I think that's the theme of integration that was shared earlier. And the planning funding can be used to support adaptation and resiliency planning, including extreme heat strategies. The third grant I want to highlight is launching very, very soon, and that is EPA's new Environmental and Climate Justice Community Change Grants, which will invest $2 billion, again, billion with a B, in the Inflation Reduction Act funds in environmental and climate justice activities to benefit disadvantaged communities. The projects are intended to reduce pollution, increase community climate resiliency, and build community capacity to respond to environmental and climate justice challenges. And the funding opportunity for this particular grant is going to become available in the next few weeks.
Great.
And finally, I want to highlight our climate change research grants. They support research focusing on how climate change affects air, water, the environment, and human health. And these grants leverage scientific and engineering expertise of our academic and nonprofit institutional partners to conduct high-priority environmental and public health research. And information on all of our grant and loan opportunities are available on our website, which is epa.gov.
All right, that's wonderful. So I'm sure that'll be of great interest to the audience and some of their constituents. So thanks for sharing that information.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. Brad, I'm going to go to you. At VA, you talked about third-party financing, so using interested third parties that will work with you in order to achieve or accomplish a goal. So talk about how that gets done and what it actually means in practice.
Sure. So in practice, what it means is that appropriated resources are a finite resource. There is never going to be enough money to do everything. And we've spent a lot of time talking about how we prioritize resilience and sustainability into our processes. But even with the right prioritization, we don't always have the money to do everything we need to do. So the performance contracting program is a great tool to help us leverage other money that isn't necessarily appropriated dollars, or to make appropriated dollars go further in the type of investments that we need to do. So VA has had great success in performance contracting. We've done about $1.2 billion with a B, but much smaller B, $1.2 billion in contracts awards under performance contracts that'll generate about $1.7 billion in savings over the life of those contracts, and then recurring savings after that on energy reductions that are there. And that's helped us get to a lot of our older goals. So we've been doing this for a decade or more. We've had reductions of over 25% in energy intensity, water intensity, greenhouse gas. So we've had a lot of success in there. But looking forward, I think there's some additional opportunities for us there. As we look at, I talked about technology, and I think that has come up a couple of times. We can change our design, but we're still behind the curve on a lot of what our private sector healthcare entities are already doing out there. By going through performance contracting, we're tapping into the same energy companies that they use for their projects. So simple example, we've just awarded a performance contract at one of our medical centers under a performance contract that'll be doing our first battery storage. And it's associated with a large solar array. So we're getting a renewable piece, we're getting to test technology on the battery and the storage side there, and we're leveraging that third-party private sector financing to help get us to that point. So there's a lot of value in there, but especially within VA, competition for resources is fierce. Our portfolio, the average age is about 60 years old for our buildings, so they need a lot of investment. At the same time, we are one of the few agencies, I think, that have a growing mission set. We've got more veterans with more service demand coming into the system, so how do we expand? How do we address an aging portfolio and layer in the resilience and other types of sustainability measures we need? The performance contracting tool is something that's been very valuable and fully expect we'll be leveraging it more. We've also done it in partnership with other agencies. So a couple of the projects we're doing with the Department of Energy's AFEC grants, which was also partially funded by the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure bills that provided DOE funding. We've been working with them and have some grant money to help us, again, test out some of the technologies that are going to be necessary for us to really get to the resilience goals we need in our mission critical facilities.
So I love that. Does anyone else have comments about third party?
Yeah, I'll just give you an example. I was excited to hear the third party financing question. We have an example at DOT. With something called the Volpe Center, which is our sort of our main research science facility up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the facility itself, 50 years old, aging, required a lot of money to upkeep. And it's right next to Cambridge, Massachusetts, right next to MIT. And so we have this facility sitting on acres and acres and acres of land. So DOT and General Services Administration, GSA, entered into what we called an exchange agreement with MIT, where we would give them that land. They're land starved up there, right, MIT?
Right.
In exchange, they would build us a brand new Volpe Center. And we just did the the ribbon cutting last month. And it is a state-of-the-art, most green, climate-friendly, sustainable building in our portfolio right now, built entirely with MIT's dollars.
Right.
In exchange, they're now getting that land that they so desperately need to expand for their own purposes. So again, in exchange agreement, again, looking at appropriated resources are finite. We have a brand new facility now that is the most state-of-the-art, climate ready, sustainable, and all we gave up was about 10 acres of land.
Well, plus you get a partner like MIT.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
Sitting
right.
on your campus.
Right, of course.
Not to mention that. Yeah.
And also
absolutely.
on the performance contract, so the Army is a big user of the Energy Savings Performance Contract. We've been using it since the 90s as well. And I'll go back to my other statement. We have 160,000 some odd buildings, and the fixed, the finite amount of appropriated dollars. As we change our standards and work with the Corps of Engineers, the new builds we can make super energy efficient. When we do major renovations, and we renovate hundreds of buildings a year, again, we can make them super energy efficient. But it's that middle section. It's the buildings that are 10 or 20 or 25 years old that are not going to get renovated anytime soon, for decades. How do we get at that? Because we don't have the appropriated dollars to do the deep energy retrofits to make them more efficient. So what we're really doing we had a long conversation with the energy performance, the energy service companies, as well as the contracting office down in Huntsville, how we can really leverage these performance contracts to do this. So we're really kind of changing how we're doing. We want to greatly expand it and really just put out requests for proposals to these energy service companies, come to our installations, and do a fence line to fence line analysis of everything. No preconditions, whatever. You tell us where we can actually save, save energy and save money by doing so, and really include, because a lot of times the building envelopes where you can really make money with energy savings, that's too expensive, and you can't realize the savings through the energy performance contract. So those are harder to do. But if we can basically group all of that with everything else on the installation and make it a package deal, then we can get at some of these things, and that's how we're hoping to get at these buildings.
So I love these levels of cooperation, and I want to go to you, Rachel, because this is something you also talk about. Tell me how the private sector is playing a role.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I think, just foot stomping that point about the finite appropriated dollars. I think the last point on this sort of third-party financing thread that I'll add before sort of expanding on some of these other examples. The DoD overall has 500,000 facilities, and our backlog for maintenance is close to $150 billion. So we have to use third-party financing and industry partners to be able to meet that. We can't appropriate our way out of that problem, and I think Paul made a great case, and the way that the Army is doing business differently is a wonderful example, and we're looking to work with the other military departments to replicate that and have kind of a full court press across the department when it comes to scaling up our third-party financing work in the next coming years, and to really institutionalize that into our policies. But
is that part of your portfolio, or how does that get adjudicated through the enterprise?
Yeah, so we have the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installations and Environment sort of owns that policy, and so that'll be going through an upgrade. They refresh these policies every so many years. And so the policy that oversees that sort of installation energy enterprise will be getting refreshed, and that'll be a way where we can fold in some of these, guidance in terms of using these tools more proactively.
But it is a desire on the part of the Department of Defense
Yes.
to collaborate more with private industry
Absolutely.
and to use the advancements of private industry, right, for defense
Absolutely, and I think
purposes.
even beyond just looking at the financing side of things, using best practices is also really valuable. On the buildings side of things, we're looking to upgrade our building codes so that we don't just have sustainable buildings, but we have buildings that are new, that are modern, and using the best practices from the modern age and not sort of the old ways of doing business. And so we'll be pulling together some of the best and brightest from industry to advise on how we can upgrade our building codes in an effective way. And so I think there's a knowledge exchange opportunity in a lot of these. And then also with technology deployment, there's a huge opportunity as well. There are organizations dedicated within the Department of Defense that focus on that. So the Defense Innovation Unit is a good example of that. I'm sure folks are familiar. They're based down in Mountain View. And they work to partner with industry and venture capital ecosystem to bring this community of innovation that isn't necessarily used to working with the Department of Defense and help make that more streamlined and more accessible, and to really accelerate the speed of deployment of these commercial technologies that are available that can help us when it comes to our energy and our sustainability and our climate goals that we just haven't been able to access yet. And so that's a great example of industry partnership that's been working well. DIU has a whole work stream dedicated to energy and climate, and so that's been really exciting to see that grow over time. And they're partnering with each of the military services on pilot projects where they're taking technologies and testing them out at different installations and in different environments, and being able to eventually scale that deployment over time. And we also have innovation programs within OSD. We have a strategic environment research and development program and sort of a sister technology certification program that works with universities and industry partners, where we'll put out a call for proposals for an environmental issue, resilience, water, energy, you name it. If there's a challenge that the department needs help solving, we can use this program to be able to bring in partners from industry and academia to help us work on some of that innovation. So I think there's a lot of great examples there that I'm happy to discuss further, but also.
Yeah, I love those those examples. So what's coming out of the private sector that they could benefit most from in civilian and defense?
Yeah, and so while I was totally aligned with my colleague on the first thing, I will have to quibble a little bit with, I do think we have a lot of the innovation we need. We don't have all of the innovation yet. Certainly we do need to scale a lot of what we have, but batteries, you mentioned, is a great example. There's still some hard yards to go, especially like where those materials come from and, different technologies that we can put into those batteries, things like that. So I do think we still also need incredible amounts of innovation still, but I thought it was fascinating because one of my sort of like big things I was going to talk about was, well, there's a lot of people out there with capital that they would like to deploy into, build sustainable buildings or putting behind the meter renewable energy, green hydrogen experiment, all the different things that are going to be needed. But you all are already solving that through, it sounds like, a lot of the performance contracts and things that you've done. So I think that's probably just for other agencies. I mean, that is a huge trend in the private sector as well. I think maybe the one other thing in the private sector, and it's kind of been alluded to here, but there's a ton of work going on, like acute and chronic physical risk, and like what do we need to do right now to triage, think about resilience, make adaptation moves, mitigation moves to help, deal with current challenges. But that longer term transition risk thinking and really organizations really starting to look to deeply quantify transition risk. So we are going to live in a low carbon world in the future, or not at all, and a low carbon economy. And so therefore, what are you doing to look at renewable energy sourcing? What are you thinking about the innovative technologies and where those need to go? What are you doing around the policy implications of not just incentives, but also in other places, carbon taxes, carbon border adjustment mechanisms? Like, there's a really big cost of not doing things. Like, you will not be a viable business, and I would say agencies will struggle with costs dramatically if they're not making these moves. So I think that's one of the biggest things, is like also having that longer term path on long-term adaptation pathways, climate transition plans, decarbonization pathways longer term, right? Because without that, we may triage some immediate problems, but we don't have a long-term future.
You're triggering a shift in thinking. I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. Just the whole evaluation of what it means to be climate resilient really needs a shift in the way people think about it, from something you have to do to something that just makes perfect sense, and the technology is enabling it to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say some of the examples Paul gave earlier, probably like some of the singularly best and most like visually grounding images you can think of, right? Of like how that will play out over time as you think about, permafrost in Alaska, for example. So, I mean, I think these are probably some of the best stories I've heard.
Yeah, they're great stories. All right, let's get back to the stories. Paul?
You let me just have stories. I'll talk all the time.
All right, let's talk about the Army's fleet of purpose-built hybrid drive tactical vehicles that are supposed to be in place by 2035. How's that going?
It is actually going, and I need to clear up any confusion. I need to differentiate right off the bat between our tactical vehicles, which are the combat vehicles we use on the battlefield, and the non-tactical vehicles, the sedans and light pickup trucks that we drive around our bases. On the non-tactical vehicles, Army's got about 52,000 light non-tactical vehicles. We are moving, just like DOT is, to convert those all to electric vehicles, zero-emission vehicles. That's going. We've already converted several thousand. We're going to convert some more in the next few years. We're working on charging infrastructure on all of our installations, not just for our vehicles, but our soldiers and all the civilians that work on the installations. They're all starting to drive the electric vehicles too. So we need to look at how we're going to allow them to charge. Just like we've got gas stations on our installations, we need to have charging stations. On the tactical side, we are moving, but we're moving much slower. We're moving very methodically for several reasons. One, the technology. We're talking about heavy vehicles, armored tracked vehicles. The M1 tank weighs 96 tons, I think. To move an M1 tank on electric power with just batteries, you need half of the weight of the M1 just in batteries. So, as you said, the battery technology is not quite there yet. So let me reassure everybody, we are not going to build a fully electric M1 tank tomorrow, okay? So, and I know we've gotten some criticism for that. We're going to do this slowly, methodically, so that what we do is increase our combat capabilities and not decrease them, and never, ever do anything to put our soldiers at risk. But by hybridizing our vehicles first, by doing it step by step, by hybridizing them, again, we reduce the fuel, we reduce the amount of fuel that's required on the battlefield. And one of the things most people don't know, the combat vehicles, when they're in a fight, they're not always moving. In fact, they spend a lot of time just sitting on the battlefield, doing reconnaissance or just holding position. But because everything's electrified in today's Army, communications, night vision goggles, you name it, you need electric power. So even though the soldiers might just be sitting in a tank or armored personnel carrier for hours at a time, they need power to generate all their, to be able to empower all their systems. So the only way to do that right now is to run the engine. If we can hybridize our vehicles, we can shut off that engine, again saving fuel, and still enable the power to the soldiers' systems. But more importantly, by shutting off the engine, we get rid of the noise and the heat from the engine. And what are the two ways the enemy finds our forces on the battlefield most effectively? Noise and heat. So by hybridizing, we're not only doing what's good for the climate, we're not only increasing the operational capabilities of our soldiers, but we're protecting our soldiers better. We're safeguarding them and reducing the risk against an enemy attack.
The Federal Health Systems Learning Network that was formed between HHS, VA, your agency, the Defense Health Agency, and the Bureau of Prisons. How does that operate, and how is it working to reduce climate dependency?
So it's been a great collaborative effort. So I know we always talk about collaboration. This is a little bit of a learning though too, and I think that's built into the name there, where we know that not any one agency is going to be able to solve all the problems, but collectively there's already been a lot of great ideas talked about. Everyone is doing a lot of different things there. So we've been able to work with them. The healthcare industry in general is unique, and we've been able to not only identify sort of internal challenges of how we operate, but also partner with our private sector healthcare industry folks. And I'll be honest, in a lot of terms like measurement of greenhouse gas and things, the private sector isn't necessarily where we are. They're a little bit behind us, but they've got the desire and the capital to help move things forward in a good direction. So collectively leveraging their power and their willingness to move forward on a lot of these efforts with us internally, we can then signal industry of where those needs are. So I think to the points that were made, there's a lot of advances in technology that's out there. One of the things that the Learning Network is focused on is not just the infrastructure, but the operations. So healthcare operations actually has a lot of potential contributions to greenhouse gas. And they've been able to focus on some of those areas to see what industry could be able to deliver. Things like anesthetic gas uses is a potentially high greenhouse gas emission contributor, but it's something that we need in healthcare delivery. So the network has been able to leverage the people who actually do the work, the clinicians in the healthcare industry, with for example, the National Academy of Medicine and their decarbonization efforts to come up with both challenges and potential solutions to some of the operational concerns that are coming up out there. And we've helped them advance some of the ideas, but we're also leveraging their power and their growth. The American healthcare system is massive. VA is big, but it certainly dwarfs it. How can we leverage that to give those demand signals to industry of where there is some additional innovation needed, where operational improvements can be made to help make sure that it's sustainable, not just from a building and a facility standpoint, but from an operational standpoint going forward.
That's really fascinating. That's great news. I appreciate hearing that information. So Rob, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts about climate resiliency and what it might look like in the next 5 to 10 years?
The biggest thing is kind of what we talk about, a lot of systems thinking, right? That one entity by itself is not going to solve these problems, and that we have to continue public-private partnerships working together to be able to move faster together than we can apart.
Oh, great. Okay. That was pretty quick. All right. Thank you for that. So let's go to you, Brett.
I think we heard a lot of themes. A lot of people are doing things in the same way. So bringing those together so that we're integrated, not just within an agency, not just across the government, but with our private sector partners. There's a huge amount of dependence out there. If we're really going to achieve what we need to achieve, we've got to be able to not only identify, but then build those networks across those dependency layers so that we can all move forward in the same direction.
All right. Fascinating. Rachel?
I'll bring the conversation back to the importance of data where we started. I think that'll be really important to make sure that the right decision makers have the right data in their hands to make informed decisions and to have that crosstalk within the organization and across their agency.
All right. Keith?
Yeah, very similar theme, the theme of collaboration is huge, right? Both from a government and private sector perspective, but also across different agencies. Everybody is doing pockets of great work, just bringing those all together to help kind of push everybody forward, as Rob was saying.
I think the conversation has been just fantastic today. Phil?
Yeah, I would just reiterate again that the effects of climate change are already impacting how we travel and damaging our infrastructure, and that means that the transportation sector and DOT, we have to be one of the biggest parts of the solution to the climate crisis. And obviously, climate change presents huge challenges, but also huge opportunities. And we want to build a better transportation system.
All right, we'd like that. Adriana?
Back in June, President Biden directed the creation of the nation's first ever National Climate Resiliency Framework, and that was released in September. So I encourage everybody to take a look at it because it provides a vision for a climate resilient nation. And one of my takeaways from that and from this panel discussion as well is that we really need an all hands on deck approach. It's not just about the federal government. We have an incredibly important role to play, but it's also about our private sector partners as well and communities on the ground.
Wonderful. Paul, you get the final word?
All right. I really what I'm noticing that's most important is more than just, it's not just an awareness of climate change, but it's really an acknowledgement that we've got to do something. I've kind of seen this as a generational thing. If you talk to someone under 30, they're going to say climate change is happening, and then they're going to curse at you saying, what has your generation done to our world? But now it's, even the older generations, whether it's an Air Force base on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico that's flattened by a hurricane, or whether it's the flooding in New York City of a DOT building because of the changing weather patterns. I heard on the radio coming in this morning about the Cat 5 hurricane that hit Acapulco, and it's flattening that city. These things are happening. We can't wait. We can have the political debate all you want, but the people on the ground are seeing it, and the decision makers and the people that implement it, we've got to do this, and everyone knows we have to do this.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all. This has been a fascinating conversation, very enlightening. We really appreciate your time, and we appreciate you joining us too. So please come back again. There are plenty more incredibly interesting topics just like this one. You can check them out at fedinsider.com. I'm Jane Norris. It's been my pleasure to be your host today.